B residential. To the south is C residence and EE retail. And to the east of us is retail, which is the Kenwood Mall. The next slide is the existing zoning plat. And again, it's very similar to the previous slide, but it also shows the dimensions of the entire parcel. The next slide is existing features. And while this slide is complex and there's a lot on it, it shows all the boundaries of the existing lots. It illustrates the topography of the existing site and shows where the existing utility easements are. If you have any questions as I go through these, please ask, but these are pretty straightforward, so I don't want to take a lot of your time to go through these. The next slide shows the existing property and parcel information. So the owners of each parcel are shown here, not only our site, but the adjoining parcels as well. The next slide shows the existing meets and bounds. So basically these are the dimensional characteristics of the site in question and the existing parcels that are there. The next slide is the existing zone districts, and this is very similar to the surveyor's slide that I showed you earlier, which shows the existing zoning of our site and the surrounding properties. This next slide shows the existing right-of-ways, both on Kenwood Road and Happiness Way. And so these are the current right-of-ways, and I'll show you a slide later that shows you the proposed features. This next slide shows you the existing utility easements. There are both, the primary easements are for both sanitary sewer and stormwater. And there are easements for both sanitary and storm coming into our property from off-site, from the south and to the west. And just a point of interest here is that in our proposed features, we're going to be obligated to take care of those issues from the properties that are adjacent to us. So just make a note of that. The next slide shows the existing storm drainage patterns. And again, as you can see, there are several different storm drainage lines that are coming onto our site from adjacent properties. Okay, the next slide shows the major trees that are on the subject property. And again, there's a couple of different stands of oak trees that are on the property at this time. The next slide shows our proposed features. And while I've gone through this a little bit on that first colored slide, let me just go through the detail of this so that you're clear on really what our proposal includes. In terms of the site data and looking at the overall land use, the multifamily, as I indicated, is 258 units. The office is 117,000 square feet. Hotels, 125 keys. And there are retail in both the office and hotel buildings that total about 16,000 square feet. Parking spaces are 9 by 19 and 9 by 18, depending on whether they're in the garage or surface spaces. Typical parking aisles 24 feet, which is a code requirement. And in terms of parking, there are on the west garage 897 parking spaces, and the east garage 393 parking spaces for a total of 1,290. Based on the 20% share ratio that is permitted under the SPI, the number of parking spaces that we're required to have would be 1,257, and we're providing 1,290. The impervious surface ratio is 77%. I've also shown on this drawing a couple of items that we'll be talking about in more detail a little later, but in the northwest corner of the site at Happiness Way, we are proposing to block off Happiness, close Happiness at that point. We're also showing on this this slide the signalization at Happiness and Kenwood Road, which we'll talk about a little more later. But one of the important things there is that there are sidewalks at that signal, which gives not only our visitors and residents and guests, but also the people that live in the Holiday Acres a better opportunity to cross Kenwood Road to get to the mall and other amenities that are there. You can also see on the left side of the drawing that there is a driveway at the far west that comes back into the parking lot. Just past the entrance to the parking garage is a gate, and the rest of that basically pavered area with that'll have actually be grass pavers. That area is blocked off except for emergency vehicles. So that will be utilized by the fire department in the event that they need to get to the back side of the building. The next slide is the proposed meets and bounds. So basically this is just a description of the boundaries of the property after all of the individual parcels are consolidated. The next slide shows the limits of construction. And one thing that I think is important to point out there, a couple of things. Number one, the limits of construction will extend into Happiness on the east side as we make Happiness 3 lanes, which we'll talk about when we get to traffic. The other note that we've made on here, which we think is very important with respect to the single-family neighborhood to the west of us, is that our intention would be to close Happiness off at least even on a temporary basis initially, so that no traffic from construction can get up into that neighborhood. The next slide shows you the construction that we're anticipating on Happiness as part of the traffic mitigation plan that we got from the county. We'll be committing to put a full signal at the intersection of Happiness Way and Kenwood Road. We'll make Happiness 3 lanes so that we have a left out and a right out from Happiness and a right in from Kenwood Road. Again, there's crosswalks at all the points here, and effectively Happiness will become a private drive almost, because once the development is complete, it will be us and the hospital that utilize Happiness. So in the pure sense of the word, it really won't be a public road at that point in time. The proposed next slide shows the proposed utility easements. And this again just shows the extent of the easements, and you can see that there are easements that connect to the existing storm and sanitary lines that come from the west and from the south from adjacent properties, and basically everything funnels through then our development onto the storm and sanitary that are currently on Happiness Way. The next slide shows a preliminary grading plan. And I think that there's a couple of things that are important here. First of all, when we were able to get and negotiate to get control of the 2 properties that were at the far southwest corner of the site, which we did not have under control when we made our initial proposal, it allowed us to do a couple of things. Number one, it allowed us to create more green space. It allowed us to deal with stormwater in a better way. And our original idea here was to do a wet retention pond to hold some of the stormwater that's coming from off-site and to assist us in terms of handling the stormwater from our site. So we had basically 2 comments, and I'll mention this again later, but we had 2 comments related to that. One was that it's going to be mosquitoes, and the other was that we're going to have geese. So we got with our civil engineer and took a look at this, and they did the calculations and came up with the actually a better solution, which is to make this a dry retention basin. And so I'll explain this a little further later, but this is now going to be a dry retention basin. Detention basin, it actually works much better than the original plan. The next slide is the utility plan. And you can see in this that there are both storm and sanitary lines that are coming into our site. We're collecting both that sanitary and the storm, routing it basically from south to north through the middle of our site and off then onto Happiness Way. We'll get into the storm calculations a little later, but basically how that works is totally dependent on what the county dictates is going to happen in terms of how you have to handle stormwater and what capacity you have to build into your development, not only to handle your own stormwater, but that which is coming into our site from other properties. This next slide is our landscape plan. And I will just go into a few of the details on this because I think it's really pertinent as it relates to the single-family residential to the west of us. So there are certain buffer requirements around the perimeter of our site, and the calculations of what's required and what's provided are shown in the landscape code summary. More importantly is that we've gone to great length to provide significant landscape buffer to the west and the south sides of our site, which is the side that's bordered by single family. We've also proposed to put an 8-foot privacy fence all along the west boundary of the property and along the first half of the south boundary. Code allows for a 6-foot high fence. We're asking for a variance there to provide 2 feet higher on that particular item. The other thing that we've proposed to do, and it's not necessarily a simple task in terms of how it's handled legally, but we have offered and proposed to the residences that directly abut the property that we would go onto their property if they like and plant 15-foot high evergreen trees against the fence on their side of the fence, so that from their houses they're not just looking at the fence, they're looking at landscaping and then the fence. We've had a couple of people tell us that, well, my lot's not going to probably allow that to happen. And we said, great, we have an allowance for each lot. If you would like to do landscaping or something else with that area at the back of your yard, go ahead and do it and give us the bill, and we'll pay for whatever our allowance was to do that. So I think there's a couple of ways to accomplish that, and we're certainly willing and have proposed for a long time to go in and do that for each neighboring owner. There's obviously a variety of trees on our side of the fence, and we're trees and shrubbery according to the specifications in the zoning code. And we've also provided a line of trees along Happiness Way and shrubbery and trees along Kenwood Road as well. Along here. Yeah, we're proposing evergreens on our side as well. Yeah, we're going to do a mix of deciduous and evergreens on the inside of the fence.
Great. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So how many trees are you removing and how many trees are you proposing? How many trees are you removing and how many trees are you proposing to replant?
Yeah, we're taking out, in terms of size, bigger trees, about 26 bigger trees, and we're adding about 167 new trees. Obviously, they won't be of the size that the existing trees are. We understand that, but they'll get there, and there will be a lot more of them. And that's within our boundary.
So that doesn't include the proposed. That doesn't include the proposed ones on the opposite side of the fence?
That does not include the trees on the outside of the fence, correct.
Any idea how many trees you're looking at there?
I think those lots, yeah, I think it's 4 per lot. But not the problem, but the issue is obviously trees hopefully don't stay the size they are when they're planted, and so you got to leave a certain amount of spacing. These are big pine trees that we're looking at. in terms of 15 feet at the time of planning.
Thank you.
The next slide, it's a little hard to see, but this shows our photometric plan. So this is our lighting plan for the site. And it basically consists of 3 different types of lighting. The first is pole lighting, which is basically on the east part of the parking garage, on the top level of that garage. And any lighting that is there is contained within that space because it's basically surrounded by buildings. The second type of lighting that we have is sconces, which are building mounted lights that shine down to the walking spaces in and around the hotel and the office building, and in and around the apartments, primarily on the side that faces the west or the east parking garage and on Happiness Way. The third primary type of lighting that we're using are bollards, which are about 30 inches high, ground mounted, and they basically provide ground lighting for walking paths and around the perimeter of the multifamily. There are, I think, the photometrics are hard to read, but I think there might be 2 little spots where there's more than a 0 lumens outside the boundary of the site. And again, the photometric map it's kind of a piece of software that, based on your locational light, it prints this out. We obviously will commit to make sure that one of them is on Happiness, and I don't think the hospital will care at all because that really becomes a safety issue along Happiness. And it might be, depending on what things look like at the end of the day, we might come back to you once completed and say, hey, we need to put in a street light or 2 here along Happiness Way. But at this point in time, that's not what we're proposing.
Greg, you said there are two spots where you may exceed 0 at the
right,
property line?
At the property line, yeah.
So you're saying one of them is on Happiness Way?
Right, and I think there's one down on the, yeah.
That'd be helpful.
Lumens are showing extending out here on the Happiness Way. So
and then is there one on the south side? I think, I couldn't, it's so hard to read, Greg. I didn't see that there was one on the south, but I thought you said in the report that there was.
There's one in between you and Kenwood Place. It's like 0.7.
Yeah, so between us and the retail center just south of us, there's another point where there's a lumen of light that goes beyond our property line. This next slide basically is just set up for the township as part of the PD submission to show parking spaces on all levels of the parking deck. So this sheet shows the lowest sub-level on the parking garage that's under the office building. The next slide shows the full level that is under the hotel and office building. The next slide is basically our overall first plan, and just a couple of things to point out there. As I mentioned, we're proposing to close Happiness at the western end of our development. We're proposing as part of this a revision, which is the retention basin, which is going to be a dry basin. As you can see from this first level plan, and I mentioned this before, the west garage is basically shielded completely on 3 sides. And one of the reasons that there are parking spaces on the west end is because one of the comments we got was that, you know, we don't want apartments on that end overlooking the residential lots. So we made that change as well. You can also see in this that that Happiness has been widened to accommodate the traffic signal at Kenwood Road. The first floor shows leasable retail space on both the office building and the hotel building. The next slide shows what the second level floor plan would look like. And as you can see, there are both the office building and the hotel are basically either rooms or office space. So there's not much change from the previous drawing. Next slide is level 3 floor plan. The next one is level 4 floor plan. Next is level 5. And the final one is level 6, which shows the top floor of the office and the hotel. The next slide is a rendering of our development looking from southwest to northeast. And you can see that below the apartment building is the retention basin, again, which will now be dry, transitions to the apartments, and then to the office and hotel along Kenwood Road. What you see in the background there is Kenwood Town Center. To the left is Jewish Hospital, and to the bottom right is Kenwood Place Retail Center.
Greg, that looks like apartment units along the left-hand edge there.
That's correct. There are apartment units on both corners, and the center section of that on the west is actually parking garage. It looks like apartments, which is what we tried to do. Then the next rendering is a viewpoint from the southeast. So basically you could be standing in the parking lot of the mall just across the traffic light from Kenwood Place looking northwest at the property, and to the left you can see Kenwood Place. To the far top corner on the right is the hospital and our development in the center. This next slide is really important in understanding what's going on with the buildings. So one of the conversations that we had with residents for some time is the height of the apartment buildings. And we originally started this project with 5-story apartment buildings throughout. If you look at this slide, you can see that on the top left section of the apartment, which is in a kind of a salmon color, that apartment section is actually 3 stories. And it varies from 34 feet in height at the far north end to 44 feet in height at the south end of that section, because the land slopes down from north to south. But that's a 3-story section there, and then it steps up behind that. Originally, again, that was all 5-story. Now, if you go down to the south, you can see on the lower level of the building, the lower section of it, to the west,